Thank you for joining. Welcome to our panel on the impact of underrepresented languages in AI. My name is Luis Dehnert. I'll be moderating today. Sorry for the slight delay. We're trying to make up for that now. I myself, I'm a fellow with in International Digital Policy with the German Ministry for Digital and Transport. So obviously we heard about the AI divide already early on today. So the issue of representation and diversity is a critical subject for inclusivity in the digital age. So AI is also a technology that is increasingly attempting to model our reality based on training data, but data often fails to capture that reality. So this is especially the case for languages. For example, we have the commonly used so-called common crawl, a data set that is made of nearly everything on the internet and which is often used to train large language models. Yet nearly half of the data in it is in English, and it leaves out more than 8,000 documented languages by UNESCO worldwide. So we are going to discuss this topic today. We are joined, as far as I know, by two speakers, which I will now let them introduce themselves. So we start with Nidhi Singh. So I give the floor to you to, yes, introduce yourself, please.
Yeah. Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. My name is Nidhi Singh. I am a project manager at the Center for Communication Governance at the National Law University, Delhi in India. I work primarily in information technology law and policy, and for about the last 5 years, I've been working in AI governance and AI ethics, focusing on a global majority approach to how AI is being developed, how norms are being formed, and how it's being regulated and governed at an international stage.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to give the floor to Gustavo Ribeiro. I think he has joined us online. Could you please introduce yourself?
Hello, good afternoon to everyone in Riyadh. I apologize because I think my camera is malfunctioning. We were trying to fix it before we started, but I was not able. I will introduce myself and then I'll try to leave and rejoin so we can see if the camera is working. But thank you all for joining. Really appreciate your presence here. So my name is Gustavo Fonseca Ribeiro. I'm a lawyer from Brazil. I hold a master's of public policy from Sciences Po, a university based in France. And I'm also a specialist consultant for AI and digital transformation at UNESCO. Here at the Global IGF, I'm speaking in my capacity as one of the youth ambassadors for the Internet Society in the year 2024. So I'm very happy to join this meeting. Yes. Thank you, Luis.
Thank you so much, Gustavo, for joining. Yes, you can try to rejoin with video. We'd love that. But Nidhi, maybe I start with you with the first question. So can you tell us a bit what are the impacts of underrepresentation of languages in AI from a human rights and also like a socioeconomic perspective?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. So I think this is something we've broadly said this in the introduction as well, but there's a lot of concerns around bias and inclusivity that comes in. But before we talk about it, I just want to talk about how when we talk about what languages that AI models are being trained on, it's not even really just that the resource-heavy languages like English are being adapted. Only specific dialects of English are being adapted. So it's not even like the English that we all speak, especially for non-native speakers, is the language that's going into the model. So we're not part of the majority in either case. Even if you do speak English, it's not your dialect of English that goes in. So even within that, it's only the version of English that's most commonly present on the internet is something that's being trained on. So in a sense, everybody's sort of being excluded. When you look at what happens from this, there's a couple of just like use cases I wanted to bring up before we get into deeper discussion. There's very real world consequences of this. So as generative AI has gone up, universities have started using models to check if generative AI is being used, if students are cheating, if they're using generative AI to turn in their homeworks or to write their papers. As a non-native speaker of English, even if you speak English with a high degree of proficiency, you are far more likely to be flagged for plagiarism, because the way that these tools are developed, it's actually developed only for native speakers of a certain dialect of English. So that's one thing. The other is also like AI-driven translation softwares that are used, which are being increasingly used in welfare uses by the state as well. They are also not working well for low-resource languages. So that's another concern. So what happens is that as part of the internet which does not speak the majority language or the majority dialect, you are already not part of the majority. And as this digital divide of the people sort of increases, the language becomes a further barrier to that. So if the generative AI also just generates in the predominant dialect, there's a very decent chance that in a few years, the internet will only be filled with this one dialect of English, only a few resource heavy languages, and all of the other languages will increasingly be removed from the internet. Another thing you can see is that it's only generative AI content that's now coming up on the internet. So as that gets collected for more training, it'll just be one language that's sort of getting repeated, and your native dialects and the way that you speak and your cultural identity on the internet will slowly be lost. So I think there's a lot of implications of what happens when generative AI models, typically ones that are actually focusing on prompt-based answers, have such a big problem with how they're being trained in terms of language.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer. I would like to give the same answer to the same question to Gustavo. Could you please share your view on that, please?
Luis, can you repeat the question, please? Because I was resetting my camera
Absolutely.
while
So I
you
was
asked it.
asking, what are the impacts of underrepresentation of languages in AI from a human rights and also a socioeconomic perspective?
Of course. That is quite interesting. So when you think of languages in artificial intelligence, the first thought that come to mind in terms of human rights is cultural rights. If we look at the International Covenant, particularly the one on human rights, particularly the one on economic, social, and cultural rights, there are broadly speaking three cultural rights protected under international human rights law. The first one being the right of access to culture, the second one being the right of a society or people to guide, to steer the progress of their own scientific progress. And the third one relates to intellectual property. So in terms of human rights, I think to understand this, to understand the impact of underrepresentation of languages, we have to understand that these technologies, artificial intelligence and the data sets that are fueling it are being, as you mentioned, primarily developed in a Western setting, let's say that way, for instance, the United States, or with European languages, with the exception perhaps of China in Asia. So when these tools are translated into other contexts, contexts that speak different languages, they're not going to work, they're not going to perform as well. And this does affect, this does affect those communities. The rights that I have just mentioned, it's going to affect how the scientific community explores this new technology, and it's also going to affect how everyday users of artificial intelligence relate culturally to the outputs of the technology. And in terms of socioeconomic benefits, I would say that you can think of this in two ways. You can think of this through supply and demand. In terms of demand for AI technology, I think this usually happens because it can bring a lot of productivity. But again, if there's underrepresentation of language, the people that speak that language, they're not going to reap the same benefits. If you look at the major language models out there, such as ChatGPT, they perform very well in English, but they perform very poorly, for example, in African languages. So this is one socioeconomic benefit that it's not going to be reaped. And on the side of the supply, though, we can think of opportunities, though, because if there is a demand for it from local communities, right, there's also an opportunity for local companies to come up. And we do have an example of this, some examples of this in Africa, for example. In Ghana, you have Ghana NLP, which is a startup producing language models in Ghanaian languages. And by the way, there are over 50 languages in Ghana alone. In South Africa, there is Lilapa AI. And another example is the Masakani Foundation, which is a Pan-African organization working also on advanced language inclusion. So I would say those are the main impacts of it. Thank you.
Gustavo. So I want to turn now to another aspect of this. So Nidhi, what is the role of legal or ethical frameworks in enhancing AI inclusivity? How can this further language-based inclusion work, in your opinion?
Thank you. So I think when it comes to AI governance, there are, of course, now some legal instruments that are coming up. Even without the legal instruments, of course, countries have their own sort of constitutional protections and human rights protections that would still apply. But primarily, a lot of AI deployment is still being governed through the use of AI ethics. They're more broad-based sort of frameworks around which you can have AI deployment. And inclusivity is a key framework in almost all of them. So the UNESCO AI ethics, even the OECD ones, all of them have something on inclusivity. Now, how that's to be implemented is actually a really interesting question. Because when you look at something like large language models and trainings, inclusivity just dictates that you should make it available in all of the languages and you should have training in all of the languages. But that's not very helpful because you actually need very high quality data sets in order to train the models. And that means that it would require significant amount of time and investment to get those models. So just to give you an example, if you try to use ChatGPT in any of the Indian languages, not maybe the bigger ones, but even some of the smaller ones like Assamese or Kannada, which is something that we try to do for fun, at some point it will start repeating Bollywood dialogues to you because they ran out of things to train it on, and the easiest thing they could find was Bollywood movies, and they started training large language models on that. So you've met the quota, basically you've checkmarked that it is inclusive, but it's not, that doesn't make any sense. The model doesn't actually work. So inclusivity, I think AI ethics, they make a good framework, but to implement that framework, you'll need to have a lot more detail attached there. Another case study that I want to talk about, this is something that has very real legal concerns, is that in the US, 4 in 10 Afghan asylum cases were derailed in 2023 because they used an AI-driven translation algorithm that was used, a generative AI-based translation algorithm. And they didn't put a lot of effort into how it translated Afghan into English. And because of that, asylum applications were being derailed. So if you are going to use, and this is like a legal consideration, so if you are going to be using generative AI in such specific but also important and critical aspects of your public welfare. Like if you're using it in healthcare, if you're using it for asylum, you're using it for security, you're using it for any sort of public welfare benefits, ideally you want to make sure that it works really well across all languages. This is especially true in countries in the global majority, which generally have a large diversity of languages. Like Gustavo said, these models are typically made and trained in the global north, where they don't have so much trouble with like such drastically different languages, so many dialects. So what will happen in these countries is that the people who potentially know English, but also the dominant dialect of English, will probably be able to access them, and the people who don't will not be able to access them. That further creates a larger digital divide. So even in English-speaking countries, it really only recognizes the dominant dialect. So like the Av dialects and all of the other dialects that are being used typically by immigrant communities in these countries also don't get recognized as well, which means that when you look again specifically at when you ask questions of ChatGPT, there is a whole field now of prompt engineering, where if you phrase the questions just right, you will get a much better answer. That is again something that's very dependent on you knowing the dominant language and being able to understand how to phrase that very specifically. So a large part of LLMs are designed to give you answers in the dominant language only if you ask them properly in the dominant language. So the setting does kind of work against you, and it requires at the very fundamental level a lot of change and investment and effort to be made into it. That might sound like it's a private concern, but it's really not, considering that you're using generative AI for public welfare. So if states are deploying AI, or if a university is using generative AI to check for cheating, and based on that, potentially like ending somebody's education career or branding them as somebody who's plagiarized, these are things that should have an actual framework which is of much higher threshold. Like this isn't about us using ChatGPT to Google jokes or check the weather or something like this. These are some things that have very real world consequences. So you shouldn't ideally, when you are deploying AI in these contexts, especially generative AI, something that's so dependent on language and your culture, it needs to have additional safeguards in place. As of right now, I think people are really only looking at technical solutions to these problems. I don't think social and legal problems can really only be solved by technical solutions. So there needs to be, I think, a more holistic approach to how you would approach this, but there does need to be some framework in place.
If I can get back on this, you said, of course, legal and governance solutions should be at the forefront, but can I ask you, maybe from a technical perspective, do you think perhaps, because with many languages you also have the problem of data availability, do you think technical solutions such as synthetic data generation could be a potential solution to also address this?
So I think synthetic data generation is something that's gotten a lot of traction over the last couple of years. And then that's gotten one set further where now you have super synthetic data, that is data that is synthesized from synthetic data. And I think all of those technical solutions work well within certain areas where they've been researched. At the end of the day, if your base data set isn't of high quality, so these are what we call resource intensive languages or resource rich languages. If you don't have the base data set built up and you try to generate synthetic data out of it, maybe the technology will catch up, but right now it just sort of exacerbates the problems in it. Another problem is that languages don't actually typically directly translate, because there's the way you write the languages and the way the concepts are sort of explained in Asian languages versus European languages does tend to differ. And in a lot of these LLMs, what it does is it has some basic idea of what the words means. And so it'll just try to like directly translate. That doesn't really work. And then also if you're using synthetic data and your base data wasn't very good quality data, you'll just end up with a lot of synthetic data, which is also replicating the same problems, and that could have further problems going down. This is something that I guess you'd need a lot of impact assessment, you'd need a lot of transparency in the model to figure out, which is, of course, something that we're struggling with right now. Because the problem with an LLM is you need a large amount of data. If you sat down and you tried to individually check every single piece of data, we'd never be able to build an LLM. So that these are things I think that, yes, you'd need technical solutions. Synthetic data could be one of them. But there's no way to be sure that that won't just exacerbate the problem right now. So unless there's some way of figuring out, okay, unless we're sure of how this works, let's at least not use it in our justice system, in our welfare delivery system, in our asylum system. Until you have that at least pause put in there, I think that's just going to keep worsening the problem.
Thank you for the well thought response. Gustavo, I'd like to get back to you. So from a legal perspective, what do you think could be other levers, so to speak, to enable more diverse data sets in AI? Maybe also perhaps thinking about copyright.
So yeah, thank you for the question. So one of the things that I had mentioned earlier, one of the three international human rights affected, right, was intellectual property. And I thought this was going to become a longer conversation. That's why I didn't mention anything in the first one. So yeah, I think one key area of law that calibrates access to data, right? Not only language, but all types of data, right? Is copyright law. But before going there, what is copyright, right? So everybody's in the same page. Copyright is basically how we assign intellectual property rights to authors. And this applies as well. So when you build a data set, that is something that you can do as well. You can protect that with copyright, and you have an exclusive use for that, and only you can license it. That also happens with the source material that is used to create data, so creative works. So whenever we're using, for instance, newspapers or like Nidhi said, Bollywood movies, those are protected by copyright. So the way we work with the copyright governance of these two types of resources, right, the data sets and the raw materials for the data sets, is going to affect access to data. But right now, our copyrights, we do have an opportunity for expansion, right, for innovation, but our copyright laws are not necessarily yet adapted to it. We've seen a handful, for example, of lawsuits in the United States between OpenAI and the New York Times, because OpenAI used the New York Times without authorization. And sorry, there's some noise around. Yeah. So this is the context. This is the problem. But there are some solutions already out there in terms of copyright. So for example, if you look at the European Union, the AI Act, they do have an exception to what they call the data mining exception. So originally it would not be permissible for an AI company to mine data from these raw materials, from the source materials like Bollywood movies or from the internet without authorization of the copyright owner. But in the UAI Act, there's an exception to that if you're doing it for non-commercial purposes. So that's one way to develop, to allow for the progress of science, enable the progress of science, but still limit the shared benefit of resources, right? A second development that we might see soon, it's in the US, they have an exception to copyright, which is called the fair use doctrine, which is not so binary, is not so certain how it applies. It is on a case-by-case basis, based on a set of criteria, such as whether a certain copyrighted material is being used for educational purposes or non-commercial purposes, or for research, for example. And some of these lawsuits that we see in the US, we might see something like that coming out of it, but we have to wait and see. Another area, and in my opinion, this is underexplored, I would love to see a larger discussion on it. There exists this concept under international intellectual property law of traditional knowledge. It protects traditional knowledge, and traditional knowledge in the sense of knowledge that have been passed from generation to generation, for example, in traditional and indigenous communities. And in the beginning of the late 90s, early 2000s, we saw a lot of debate on that when it came to healthcare, when it came to medicines and traditional medicines, because you'd see a lot of big companies using these traditional medicines, and which were invented by communities and those communities not benefiting from it. And yet we're yet to see this debate in the context of artificial intelligence and data. Data has become, per se, the new oil, but we haven't seen any stakeholders talking very strongly about how this idea of traditional knowledge communicates with this new, very valuable resource. And just to conclude, another challenge that we have, which is not copyright law, but is associated with it, is personality rights. The personality right is, for example, how is the right to your own likeness, your voice, your image, your face, and other people can only use it if you have given consent. And this is not an economic right, it's a moral right, it's attached to your personality. it belongs to you because you're a human, not because you own any property, which is often the case, which is generally speaking what happens with copyright. So what that means is that um, it cannot be easily given away, sold away in a market, for example. So right now we've actually seen some decisions by courts. For example, in India, the High Court of Bombay has found that like when an AI replicates the voice of someone who exists, that is a violation of personality rights. But what we don't know is if taking the voice of someone and using it to train an AI, and if that in itself is a violation. Like, what if an AI is trained with it, but we don't know, but it doesn't necessarily replicate it, right? That is an area that we don't know. And deciding on that, the law would also require some adaptation to either allow for the expansion of data or narrow it, right? With that, I conclude my remarks. Yeah, thank you.
Very insightful. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to pose one last question to the both of you. So, in my opinion, we can observe that this problem of limited language inclusion in AI leads to efforts on a national or regional level, where countries and regions build their local data sets and models. So thinking more of the international perspective, what steps can we take to together within international organizations or beyond build more diverse AI? I would, Nidhi, maybe you want to start?
Thank you. And you're right, actually. I think a lot of the efforts that come for something like this come domestically because, I think that's maybe a better place to start, but also probably because state and governments have a far better incentive. So you don't make AI accessible because it's financially lucrative. It may not always be, depending on the community. And if it's not financially lucrative, then why would somebody like OpenAI be doing this? So it's usually up to the states to make this. So just to give an example, also the large language models that have been run in regional languages in India, like Jugalbandi, they're also done in partnership by the state. So I think that in this case, it's important to focus on the fact that this isn't like a favor that's being done. Inclusivity is in fact an essential part of it's an essential access to the internet is in fact considered now an international human right. So if you are launching something like LLM, which is fast trying to replace large parts of the internet, you are required to make that accessible to everybody. And like Gustavo said, if you are using public data, there is an, I think, implied expectation that you would use it for public good. So it's not like, oh, you can also do public good with it, but no, you are in fact training it on everybody's data, so you are required to do good with it. So I think that it'll be good to maybe in international organizations bring this under the head of inclusivity, I mean, accessibility and inclusivity. And in that sense, sort of like apply the same protections to it that we are doing when we're trying to spread internet to everybody, generally trying to bring everybody online. And yeah, I think to some extent, even for private players, like depending on how the initiative is structured, there might need to be some requirements of including at least some percentage of languages within their training data set. But all of this will really only be possible once you have transparency and accountability mechanisms down, because we don't actually know how the data is, what data is being collected, exactly how they're training it. So unless you have like very solid sort of transparency mechanisms and accountability mechanisms to see what they're using to train all of these models with, I think it'll be hard to really push anything through. It's a very interconnected problem. You want to have inclusivity. In order to have that, you want to have accountability and transparency. So yeah, I think once you get from ethical AI to actually implementing it, I imagine a lot of the things will get sorted.
Sava, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, of course. So what can we do at the international level and international organizations in particular? I had three things that have come to mind. The first one is sharing of knowledge and strategies to enhance language inclusion. Countries can learn from one another, right? For example, in India, there's this great initiative called Karya, which is a nonprofit that has this platform that allows data workers and data annotators to go on it, work on providing information and curating data sets. And once this data set is sold by Caria, the profit, the revenue associated with that data set is distributed with the workers. So here we have a case that first we get increased inclusion of Indian languages, and we manage to revert the profits of it to a socially beneficial purpose, right? Helping data workers, which are often don't have the best working conditions in the value chain of artificial intelligence. So bringing that from one country, and this platform, for example, is open source. So international organizations, they do have the ability of bringing knowledge that exists in India, for example, to other countries that are in similar situations, for example, in Africa or with indigenous languages in Latin America. The second one I would say is capacity building. Whatever we do with artificial intelligence, we often need data and technology and models. We often need governance as well, like laws that enable its development, but we always need human talent. So even this example that I gave with Caria, a platform doesn't exist by itself, right? It needs training people around it to do it. So I think international organizations can work in capacity building. It's actually been one of the priorities outlined in the Global Digital Compact when it comes to artificial intelligence. And I'd say the third one is bringing a better balance of power to conversations on international policy. It's when we're speaking of digital divides in particular, there's a clear imbalance of power and ability to tailor this conversation, for example, between the global north and the global majority. Wealthier countries have more resources to participate in this conversation in comparison to low-income countries, for example. So international organizations, they also have the ability to provide a fora in which these different actors can talk face-to-face. Yeah, so I would say these are three potential roles. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I would like to open up this session to questions either from the in-person audience or from online. I think we have an online moderator, so please let us know if there are any questions online. And yeah, please also state to whom you want to direct your question. We have a mic in person right here, so if you have a question, please step forward. And yes, you're free to ask now. Any questions from the online audience?
We don't have any as of now, but if there aren't any, I have one to throw out to the group. There's been lots of talk about the way that we use platforms to gather this data, either from a technical sense or from more of just a user interface sense. Are there things that you all think would be beneficial to creating a universal platform for data collection? There have been lots of different ones. How would you see that going? Thanks.
Should I start? Universal platform for data collection it's a very interesting idea. I think that I've also heard a lot of conversations about AI commons and data commons. And yeah, the principle behind it is quite sound, because basically what you're saying is that you put all the data in one place so that everybody can benefit from it. And I do think that in principle, that sounds good. I do think, however, and I think this might be a bit pessimistic of me, realistically, data is quite like the new oil. It's very unlikely that anybody who has a lot of data would want to share it in a way where other people can profit off of it as well. Well-labeled data is currently one of the biggest resources that we have, like good, clean data that you get for training these things. There are economies now built around these kind of data and data brokers. So I do think that actually putting that into place would be difficult. It's also very interesting, and this is something that I thought of after Gustavo was speaking. Is we've talked a lot about copyright, but I think it's quite impressive how much acceptance things like large language models have in our society right now. So when something trawls the internet to collect information to train a large language model, there is a very good chance that you will end up catching a lot of personal data as well. And typically, personal data protections used to be very stringent about like what you can train models on. Now we're seeing an increasing trend where, because of the lucrative promise of LLMs, countries are just saying that if you posted it on the internet and a large language model caught it, then I guess that's just fine, as long as it isn't directly harming your privacy in a way that the output is harming you, like the case of the Bombay High Court where his voice was directly being used. A lot of these protections are diluted when it comes to training the LLM itself. In that era of people sort of prioritizing, I think, economic progress or economic incentives that you can potentially get from generative AI, I think it's very unlikely that people would agree to pool all of the data in a uniform platform. I hope that that would be the case, but I do think that it's unlikely that people would agree to that.
Yeah, and if I may jump on the question as well.
Yes, surely, please.
I find Thanks. I find it to be a very interesting uh, interesting proposal to think of a data commons, right? But it's so the one I will first speak of a challenge and then of someone who's trying to do that. So the biggest challenge I see is how bringing data to the open source world, opening data up in a market of technology that is so highly competitive, affects comparative advantages between companies. So market advantages, right? So it is true that openness, intuitively speaking, leads to more access to data. And you often see this advocacy, right? Oh, to companies, you see it also a lot in the development context. Open the data so everybody can have access to it. But openness can also come with a trade-off of financial sustainability, right? If you open the data without any restrictions whatsoever, it's not that easy to profit from, to have a revenue from that. And in developing contexts, the socioeconomic security of companies and the people working on it it's a very big priority. But more importantly so is, if you manage to get people on board with this idea, you have to either get everyone or no one to create a data commons. Because from the moment you get people, a certain amount of companies into the commons, share the data for free, the companies that are private and have the size to continue charging, like they're private and have not opened their data and already have a big, like it's already big, like a big tech company, they're gonna have a financial advantage over whoever opened their data. And because their model will be more profitable, their model is also gonna grow more, which could actually crowd out the commons, the common data pool. So that is the challenge I see. It works a lot like a negative externality. You either get everyone on board or it's hard to implement it. But the second point is there is an attempt to implement that kind of thinking actually in the European Union through the Data Governance Act. I wish I was the type of lawyer who was an expert in that. I am not, but there is this regulation at the European Union level, the Data Governance Act, coupled with the Data Act, in which they try to create pan-European pools of data sets in certain fields that are profitable, like agriculture, healthcare, mobility data. And the way they're trying to build that is by kind of creating a compulsory licensing arrangement. Like, so the public sector can buy data sets that are of public value from private entities, and the private entities, they're mandated to sell it for a reasonable price. That's literally what the law says, a reasonable price. So it's somewhat of an attempt to do that, but still incorporate the cost structure of developing data sets. But whether it works or not, well, we'll see. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So I think we have 2 questions from the audience. Maybe we start with the madam in the front. Would you come to the microphone, please? And then we check quickly whether it's on. Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you so much for the great session and presentations. I guess my question goes to both of you. You did speak when you're talking about the recommendation on domestically having the incentive coming from government. And I think Gustav online, he had also mentioned some of the large language models in Africa. I think you mentioned Lelapa AI in South Africa and Masakane. So my question is, do you see a lot of appetite, especially from governments, to actually support a lot of these initiatives to develop our own local languages and having them included in these models? That's the first one. And then the second one is just something that I've noticed from a very practical perspective, where I'm originally from Zimbabwe, and for a learner to graduate and go to university, you must have passed mathematics and English. So not even our local language is included. So I was just thinking from an incentives perspective that why would I, if I'm a software developer, invest in local languages when they are not useful to students and learners who are supposed to be using these technologies? Because you need English to go to university, and all your products should be in English, and you are making use of AI products in English. So I don't know how you see it. Maybe you have practical examples from your regions where there is direct incentive from government financially to support a lot of these initiatives. And as well with the school system, are there going to be any changes where we see more and more local languages actually being integrated? For you to move to the next level, you must have at least passed a local language, not necessarily just English. So those are my 2 questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. Those are actually really good questions. So for the first one, I think we have seen a lot of appetite for translation in local languages, very specifically from the government because of the use of translation softwares in the judiciary. So there are maybe 200 languages spoken in India, about 30 of them officially recognized as well. So what happens is the court actually works in all of these languages. The government works in a lot of these languages simultaneously, and that means that the courts have to work in all of these languages. At least in the higher judiciary, a lot of the judges work in English, so you need translators. And you need translation. They're trying to bring in translation softwares so that defendants and accused can understand what's happening in courts. So because of that also created a lot of appetite for these things to work. So the government needs essentially really good high quality translation softwares, which launched a lot of the reason why you have so much generative AI happening in local languages. Also in countries where you have many languages, if the government wants to pass something like a chatbot for farmers, which is another thing that's happening, you need to make sure that it's available in a lot of the languages. And if it is not, then you could theoretically go to the court and argue for a violation of your right to equality, because it's a recognized state language and you are not offering the service in that recognized state language, and that's a violation of a right to equality. So because of this, I think we are seeing a lot more appetite, but more specifically from the government, because this isn't from a financial incentive point of view, to actually, build data sets in these languages, build generative AI, and then eventually get to building like translation softwares. As for the second question, that's a very complicated question, I think, which doesn't maybe have a legal answer. It's more of a sociological answer. I know that some states in my country have a 3-language model where you must study 3 languages in school just because of how it works. I think this is just a general problem that many countries that have multiple languages have is the fact that the internet and the internet infrastructure, and now increasingly AI, is all really built on like one common thing, which happened to be a specific dialect of English. Until you can have a lot more inclusivity in the room where these decisions are being made, that is unlikely to change. But I think that is something that you're trying to do through these conversations, is to just say that that actually doesn't make any sense. If you just have a chatbot that really only recognizes English and like a specific way of accessing a service, then that's not an accessible service. You need to have like more either human intervention and all of these problems. But yeah, I think that's a more sociological problem that I think the world generally has like a majority perspective on things, and it's not looking at minority perspectives or just like a diverse group of perspectives on these things. That is something I think that will really only get fixed when you have more voices in the room talking about what the experiences are.
Okay, with the time in mind, we have 1 minute roughly left. Gustavo, do you want to add to that quickly?
I think Niti's answer was very good. So very quickly, government support. Yes, you can see examples. For example, in Rwanda, the government has been quite supportive of developing data sets in Kenya, Rwanda. Is one example in partnership with academia and startups. And in Nigeria, you can also see the government supporting the development of a large language model in Nigerian languages. As for the second question on the education, I would say that Nidhi's was on spot. I think Nidhi's answer. I would add that so the market is a powerful tool to drive development of AI. And in many countries that speak many languages, this market is in English. It is true. For example, in Kenya, that is the case. Uganda as well. But you also have other purposes, right? Public services, for example, access of citizens to welfare, and research, which doesn't necessarily have to have a commercial purpose. So in that context, I would say it's quite relevant. I hope I'm touching on the question. And there was a question in the chat which asked about the opportunities and risks of the localization, which is going beyond it's contextualizing the model as well to the local culture. On the opportunities and risks, I would say very quickly, the opportunities, first, because it's useful. People have a demand for solutions in their local language, and those tools work better for them. And the second, just cultural preservation, I think will be an opportunity. And the risks, I would refer to risks at large of associated with AI, even if you're doing in a local language with local culture embedded, you still have privacy risks, you still have bias risks, and yeah. Thank you. I will give back the floor.
So I saw that there was one in-person question at least left. Maybe I would ask you to, if Nidhi still stays here, you can also ask it after the session. I would like to thank our speakers for the very interesting insights, also to the audience for the good questions. And yeah, I wish you a few other good sessions today, and yeah, enjoy IGF. Thank you.